Since the war in Iran kicked off, it's been difficult to know where Saudi Arabia really stands. In public, the Saudis have counselled for peace, but a number of news outlets have claimed that, in private, senior Saudi officials, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, commonly known as MBS, were telling Trump to escalate in Iran in order to finish the job, and even that the Saudis are on the cusp of declaring war against Iran themselves. However, this much-anticipated declaration of war never ended up happening, and on Wednesday, a number of outlets reported that the Saudis had become so furious with Trump's chaotic policy in Iran that earlier this week they denied the US access into Saudi airspace. It's hard to overstate quite how massive this is. The Saudis are supposed to be America's big Arab ally, and the kingdom's decision to close their airspace essentially collapsed Trump's latest gambit, Project Freedom, which was supposed to involve the US Navy escorting commercial ships out of the Strait of Hormuz, but relied on air support via Saudi Arabia. So in this video, we're going to explain why it looks like the Saudis have finally turned on the US, and whether this represents the proverbial nail in the coffin for a relationship that was already going downhill. The next issue of our magazine is out very soon, with this issue focusing on all of the wars that Trump has been involved in during his second term, with each dot on the cover representing a different military intervention or strike. Inside, we run through each of the conflicts, from Venezuela and Iran to Yemen and Ecuador, as well as discussing what he's really doing. Pre-order your copy today at toolong.news. So let's start by explaining why the Saudis have never been that enthusiastic about the war in Iran. At first glance, you might expect the Saudis to be pretty keen on Operation Epic Fury. After all, the Saudis are one of Iran's traditional enemies and one of America's traditional allies, so you might thus assume that they'd be up for a US-led war to topple the Iranian regime. However, there are at least 4 reasons that the Saudis were always going to be skeptical of a war in Iran, especially one without clear strategic objectives. The first, and arguably most structural reason that the Saudis might be skeptical, is that, in short, the Saudis prioritize stability over everything else. The Saudis and the rest of the Middle East know from experience that regional instability is difficult to tamp down once it gets going, and that prosperity, of the kind that the Gulf has experienced in the past 2 decades or so, relies on stability. This is why the Saudis are so furiously angry at the UAE at the moment. The UAE have been sponsoring separatist outfits in Sudan, Yemen, and Somalia, and the Saudis see this as potentially destabilizing. Equally, this is why the Saudis were always going to be at least a bit skeptical of military action in Iran. There's obviously the risk of regional instability, which is bad news for the Saudis. The second reason is simply that the Saudis were always going to bear some of the brunt. Not only has the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz reduced Saudi oil exports at a time when they need as much cash as they can get, Iran also hit targets inside Saudi Arabia in retaliatory strikes. The third reason is that there was a sense that the war, nominally a joint effort between Israel and the US, was being driven by the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu, who have very different strategic objectives to the US and its Gulf allies. American officials actually admitted as much. In early March, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio basically admitted that the US went to war in anticipation of an Iranian attack on Israel, and the New York Times reported in April that Netanyahu personally convinced Trump to go to war by insisting that regime change in Iran would be not just possible, but easy. According to that report, Netanyahu also claimed, mistakenly, that the US and Israel would be able to quickly destroy Iran's missile and drone programs, that Iran would only be able to impose minimal damage on America's regional allies, and that Iran wouldn't be able to close the Strait of Hormuz. Anyway, the point is that Israel's strategic influence was always going to provoke some unease amongst the Saudis, both because Saudi-Israel relations have cratered since Israel's assault on Gaza, and because the Saudis suspect that Israel has some very different strategic objectives. Specifically, the Saudis suspect that the Israelis wouldn't mind essentially turning Iran into a failed state, which is something that the Saudis really don't want. From Israel's strategic perspective, this wouldn't be a terrible outcome, at least in the short term. It would get rid of a regional nemesis and probably remove the perceived nuclear threat that the Iranian regime currently poses. But from a Saudi perspective, a failed state in Iran would be disastrous, because again, it would risk massive regional instability. The fourth reason is that at the same time as Saudi-Israel relations have cratered, the Saudis' relations with Iran have actually improved. We first got a sense of this back in 2023, when China brokered a normalization agreement between the two countries. But relations continued to be warm throughout 2024 and 2025. And late last year, MBS and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian met in Qatar, where Pezeshkian apparently suggested a, quote, Islamic alliance to deter Israel. Obviously, Saudi-Iran relations have gone downhill since, well, Iran attacked them. But it's worth noting that the intensity of Iranian strikes against Saudi Arabia really dropped off in the opening days of the war, and they haven't launched anything against them since March. Rather, in their most recent strikes, Iran has actually focused almost exclusively on the UAE, presumably at least in part as an attempt to exploit the growing rift between the Saudis and the UAE. For context, while the Saudis and UAE weren't on great terms before the war, there was some hope that the war in Iran and the prospect of a common enemy might encourage a rapprochement. This hasn't happened. Instead, the UAE have been infuriated by the Saudis' reluctance to get more involved in the war, and this growing rift is one of the big reasons that the UAE left OPEC last month. You get the idea. The Saudis were always going to be skeptical of any war in Iran, but this doesn't mean that they were necessarily going to oppose it outright. But the haphazard way in which Trump has actually prosecuted the war, and the fact that the US doesn't have any clear plan to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, has apparently pushed the Saudis over the edge. As a final thing, this could be the final nail in the coffin for the US-Saudi relationship. The structural basis for the long-standing alliance has collapsed. The US no longer needs Saudi oil, and it's actually the world's biggest oil producer. The Saudis no longer run a massive so-called petrodollar surplus that they can then recycle into US assets and government debt, and most of the American political class wants to get out of the Middle East and focus on the Asia-Pacific and China instead. In many ways, the Saudi-US relationship was saved by Trump, who's very chummy with MBS and can't help himself from getting dragged back into the Middle East. But with MBS clearly souring on their relationship, it's hard to see this amity persisting, especially once Trump leaves office. There's much more to discuss here though, with this being just one example of Trump's international influence and escapades. As I mentioned, the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out very soon, where we dive much deeper into all of these conflicts. And if you've stuck around this long, you're probably interested to hear more of our thoughts. Plus, if you subscribe using promo code SUMMER26 at checkout, you'll get 20% off every copy as long as you stay subscribed, plus an additional £3 off your first copy. It's not just Trump's wars and conflicts either. The summer issue of Too Long contains news from each region, including pieces from elections around the world, including the UK, Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovenia, and Denmark. A piece on whether we're heading into a new world war, the Euro's missing members, an update on what's happened following the Gen Z protests of last year, as well as a rundown of Trump's continued threats towards Greenland. Speaking of Greenland, if you didn't already know, we visited Greenland to film a series called What's the Big Deal with Greenland? While we were there, we explored the vast, impenetrable country, camped out on a glacier, and drove to the US's abandoned military bases. The first episode will be out very soon, with all episodes exclusively available to TLDR Party members. You can learn more about TLDR Party by clicking the link in the description, but the cheapest way to sign up is in a bundle with Too Long. So if you're going to subscribe to the latest issue of the magazine, then consider grabbing yourself a TLDR Party membership at the same time. Find out more about both at toolong.news.